So we're looking ahead. We've got an election coming up. Do you believe that coronavirus and the economy will be back up to a regular world, by November? Or what are you anticipating by the time the election season rolls around?
I know that there's one gentleman that is going to work very hard to see that it is. And I think, in a lot of respects, his reelection hopes hinge a little bit on how successful we are in the fall and what things are happening in the fall. But it's, again, extremely hard to predict what's going to happen. There are an awful lot of variables at play in this year's election that we ordinarily don't have to incorporate into our, analysis and evaluation.
So we started off talking about with municipal bonds and cities and states. And I think even back in our very first interview, we talked about how does all of this work? Because you can't just go in and fire the CEO of the state, right? If you fire that governor, another governor pops up and they've still got all the same problems. Do you sell all of the municipal buildings? Do you sell what the state owns? How does all this work?
Yeah, well, I think, again, we've got a really interesting case study in Detroit. And if you think about the fact that you have $1 of revenue and you've got $1.60 of expenses, then if you can borrow 60 cents from somebody, you can make it all work out, right? Then you have $1.60 of income and $1.60 of expenses. The problem comes when you can't borrow any longer. And then you have $1 of revenue and $1.60 of expenses, and you have to start cutting the expenses. So the first expenses that were cut in the city of Detroit were the debt service expenses, the cash going out to pay bonds. That may not be fair. I mean, I'm sure there were people laid off and services suspended, but on the whole, the bondholders suffered because the city couldn't make debt service. And the pensioners suffered because the city couldn't make pension fund contributions. And the citizens suffered because the city couldn't provide services. So you don't go down to zero, right? It's not like the city is going to have zero revenue. The city's going to have some revenue coming in from tax receipts and license fees and tickets being issued for speeding or what have you. So there is going to be some revenue coming into the city funds, the general fund and the other funds that the city has. Then you need to do a right sizing, right? Somebody needs to come in, just like they did in Detroit. They set up a committee led by a person that said, we can afford to do this, we can't afford to do that. We've got this much money we can count on, we've got to cut here. And, they made some, pretty arbitrary determinations based on what rights you thought you had as a bondholder or as a pensioner. They made some pretty arbitrary determinations of what they would take the cash in and deliver it out. That is the reason why you want to elect a governor and administrations that operate with fiscal sustainability in mind, because it's easy to say, Vance, if you vote for me, I'm going to flood you with money from the state coffers in some variety of forms. And the other gal is saying, oh no, Vance, we have to be fiscally conservative and we have to sustain ourselves. Well, some people are going to vote for the person that says we have to be conservative and sustain ourselves, and some people are going to say, hey, I like the idea of getting a new Camaro, so I want the money from the government. And you end up in a situation where if that happens for long periods of time and you're not focused on fiscal sustainability, you create dire situations where there isn't enough money coming in to pay out all the hands that are out, and you have a failure. And the next in line, a lot of people think is the state of Illinois. They have had really difficult trouble. The way that they are managed, they have a relatively low state income tax as compared to other states, and they have a relatively high property tax rate. They have extremely poorly funded pension funds. They have extremely high bills due, right? So if you, I think we talked about this even a year ago, if you mow the grass at the state capitol, it's going to be like 17 months before you get paid because they're that far behind paying their bills. And nothing.
And what business can hold that? Like, what business can afford to pay for the gasoline and the labor and the fixing of their lawnmowers to be able to do that? Eventually, somebody will say, "Well, I just won't mow the lawn for you anymore."
Right, and so the state has a way of being able to say, well, so if a business did what the state did, at some point the banks would say, "We're not going to lend you any more money because we don't see a way to get it paid back." What the state of Illinois has done and what other states have done is they've said, well, we're going to capture our sales tax. Instead of just sort of using it in our normal, general activity, we're going to ring fence that money and we're going to issue a bond where you're guaranteed first call on our sales taxes. So they're able to borrow more in an environment when their credit's getting really shaky because they enhance the bond so that you're willing to buy it and put a yield on it that they're willing to accept.
Are you willing to buy Illinois bonds?
I don't. At this particular point, I don't know enough about what's going on. Probably don't want to rely on the next 20 years of my life being financed by debt service from a general obligation bond in the state of Illinois.